Hello, welcome back to another episode of Mediocre Painting with Wayne. Today we're going to talk about putting your airbrush together. So without further ado, let's just get into it. So what we've got here, this is just a basic air compressor that I believe came from Amazon. These usually run from about 80 to 100 bucks, and you typically get a compressor along with a handful of accessories. But these usually show up looking like this right out of the box, and you'll have a pressure regulator that goes with it. Now, if you don't have a pressure regulator and it just has an empty socket to screw your airbrush hose into, don't do that. Go buy you one of these pressure regulators. You can get them at Lowe's for about 12 to 15 bucks, and you can get them off of Amazon for about the same price. But you need a pressure regulator with a moisture trap, because this is going to make your life much easier when it comes to adjusting your airbrush. As the name implies, the pressure regulator regulates the pressure of the air going to your airbrush. And within paint lines, different colors can spray better at different PSIs, so the ability to adjust this on the fly, up or down, is invaluable. So if you've got a compressor that didn't come with one of these, get one. They're cheap, and I promise you'll thank me later. So let's get to the first part of the assembly. I have this other pressure regulator here to show the different types you can get. This is the one that came with this airbrush, so it's already got the correct fittings screwed in. And this other one here is more of a heavy-duty pressure regulator. I got this from Lowe's for about 30 bucks, and it actually didn't come with any of the fittings in it, so I had to buy them separately. It's not too hard to track down the correct size fittings for whatever kind of air compressor you've got, and you'll be good to go after that. Now, for my setup, I like to use these quick release nozzles so that I'm not screwing and unscrewing a fitting every time I switch out airbrushes. You can buy these at Lowe's or Home Depot. They're usually only a couple of bucks, so if you travel with your airbrush or you're like me and you switch out your airbrushes a lot, it's money well spent. So anyway, this is a basic continuous pressure compressor. I don't personally like these. I prefer the ones with a compressor on the top and the tank on the bottom. That way, you don't get the slight pulsation in your airflow. But if this is what you've got, this is what you've got, and that's okay. Like I said, I'm just bougie. So what started this was my buddy Jeff when he came to me with his new airbrush. His came with a disconnected pressure regulator and a tiny roll of this Teflon tape, and he wasn't exactly sure how to put all this together. This Teflon tape I've heard people refer to as plumber's tape, and it actually goes around the threads to prevent leaks, and it works really well. If you just screw this metal to metal here with no sealant on it, it'll possibly hiss air out of your tank, and you'll have an inconsistent pressure, and you don't want that. So the first thing we want to do is wrap our fitting with this Teflon tape. This isn't hard to do, and it's okay if it gets a little messy, but you want to wrap the tape in the same direction you'll be turning the pressure regulator when you screw it into the compressor, so that it doesn't strip off when you put it in place. Remember, righty-tighty. It doesn't take a lot, just a little bit of tape around your threads so that when you screw it in here, it compresses down. If the compressor that you buy doesn't come with this tape, you can pick some up at any hardware store, and a roll like this will literally last you forever. So we've got our Teflon tape wrapped around, and now we're going to take our pressure regulator and screw it into the housing. And you really don't want to go super tight here because you'll risk cracking the fitting if you over tighten it. Usually, you'll have just a little bit of a gap. That tape is going to keep that sealed, and if you're yanking on your hose, it'll have some give, so you aren't going to risk breaking your fittings. If I really wanted to, I could turn this one last time to really get everything tight so that it doesn't move, but that's not necessary. Also, if you have the pressure regulator just a little bit looser, you'll have room to tilt it so that wherever you're facing, you can make it easier to keep an eye on your air pressure and adjust as you go. This works if you've got your compressor sitting on the floor or it's on the table beside you. Either way. Just remember, the important thing is that when you turn on your airbrush compressor, you don't hear any air hissing out. If you hear that, you've got a leak, and you're going to need to tighten things up a little bit more before you start painting. So the next step is going to be connecting your air hose to your pressure regulator. Like I said, this isn't the setup that I would use. I use the quick disconnects, but most of you are going to get an airbrush with a screw-on fitting. So once again, you could just screw this on, metal to metal, and these hoses have a little rubber gasket inside here that'll help prevent any leaks from occurring. So if you're going to be taking things apart and putting it back together a lot, or moving your compressor from place to place, you'll be fine. But for a more permanent setup, I'd recommend using a little bit of the Teflon tape around the fittings so that you can just set everything up and not have to worry about any leaks. So that's going to be your connection point there. And so you take the other end. This fitting also comes equipped with an O-ring and a rubber gasket. And you take that and screw it into the end of the airbrush. And now you're ready to rock and roll. And that is the basic assembly of an airbrush. So now, my personal setup is a little different. It's what I call the lazy man setup. This is my inline pressure regulator, and my compressor sits at the end of a workbench about 15 feet away from where I actually sit and do my airbrushing. So I have a pressure regulator connected to my air compressor, as well as this inline pressure regulator. I keep the one on my compressor at about 40 psi, and then I can adjust the inline one wherever I want, whether it's 12 or 18 or 24 psi. And that way I have consistent pressure to this fella, and then it goes from there to my braided hose to my airbrush. Now this isn't something you have to have, but I've got the quick release plugged into the back fitting, and then I have another quick release on the front that goes to my braided 10-foot airbrush hose because I like to be way the hell away from everything and make it difficult for myself to adjust the PSI. So this is nice for when I'm changing things up. I really would recommend these quick release valves to anybody. Being able to sit down and paint without spending 10 minutes putting my airbrush setup together is definitely worth a few extra bucks. Just not to have to fiddle with the tape. Especially if you're like me and you have a lot of airbrushes with different needle sizes that you're constantly switching out. It's so much faster and easier to just snap the hose off of one airbrush and snap it on another with a quick disconnect without spilling paint or dropping anything. It also helps to keep you from thinking about the existential dread in your life. And that's pretty much the basics of how you set up your airbrush. The most important thing is using a pressure regulator and getting that Teflon tape in the right spot so that you avoid any leaks. So comment if you got any comments or suggestions. Let me know if I missed anything, and I hope this video was helpful. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.